All right, today we are going to run through Zechariah chapter 3 and 4. It is a couple of chapters filled with visionary experiences. As we saw last week, Zechariah has these visions starting about midway through chapter 1, and they go through chapters 3 and 4. So Zechariah chapter 3 starts a new visionary experience. He then showed me the high priest Joshua standing before the angel of Yahweh, with Satan standing on his right to accuse him. The angel of Yahweh said to Satan, "May Yahweh rebuke you, Satan. May Yahweh rebuke you, since he has made Jerusalem his choice. Is not this man a brand snatched from the fire?" Now Joshua was dressed in dirty clothes as he stood before the angel. The word Satan is a noun in Hebrew that means accuser. So when it says that Satan was standing ready to accuse, it was the accuser ready to accuse. It was like he was ready to make his case. This word accuser, here translated as a proper name, Satan, was like a prosecutor. And we think of that term in our legal context, a prosecuting attorney. And that is his role, to prosecute and to make charges against. And here he was going to bring charges against Joshua, and he was ready to do it. But before he gets a word in, God says, "Just shut up, Satan. You don't have anything to say, because I've chosen Jerusalem and I have saved Joshua from destruction. And so just don't say a word." But we see that since Joshua was dressed in dirty clothes, and those dirty clothes are a symbol of sin on him, that Satan had every right to accuse. Satan wasn't doing anything unethical or improper to accuse Joshua of sin when he's standing there covered in dirt. In fact, the Hebrew is at least suggestive that he's covered in, well, generously we might say manure. It is a filthy, dirty clothes that he's standing before God in. And so Satan, the accuser, is going to bring his case against this covered in filth man. And God says, "You just don't say a word." And then, in the next section, the angel then spoke as follows to those who were standing before him. "Take off his dirty clothes, dress him in splendid robes, and put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and dressed him in clean clothes, while the angel of Yahweh stood by and said, "See, I have taken your guilt away." So it is just a change of clothes that Joshua undertakes, and God says, "Take those dirty clothes off of him, put clean clothes on him." And Joshua doesn't even have to do anything for this process. He just stands there while the attendants of God change him into new clothes. As I think more about this, I think it is a remarkable scene that Zechariah sets before the Jews who are hearing this vision. For you and I, this doesn't sound too remarkable. It's the way we normally envision forgiveness. God forgives us. He lets us put on Christ, and because of Christ, we have clean clothes from Christ's forgiveness. But for the Jews, this was odd, for Joshua to not have to do anything to be forgiven, to get those clean clothes. Even the one sort of similar situation we see in Isaiah, where Isaiah comes before the Lord, and then he's worried because he has an unclean tongue, is that the angel takes a hot coal from the altar and puts it on his lips, not his tongue, puts it on his lips and purges the sinfulness, the uncleanness from his lips, and then he is appropriate. But then there's still the hot coal touching his lips to purge the sin. Here, there is no even sense of it. So the Jews that are listening are thinking, in order to be right with God, I have to make the sacrifices, or I have to isolate myself because I'm unclean. I have to be alone for 7 days or whatever, and the priest has to come. There has to be a process for me to get right with God again that involves some kind of sacrifice and an effort. But Zechariah pictures Joshua just standing in front of God, and even though he's covered in filth, God simply says, take off those filthy clothes, put on these clean ones. And I think that's a remarkable change of thought about how do I get right with God in order to be with him and in his presence. It's all God's doing. He's doing all of that in this picture. And I believe Zechariah is anticipating, of course, Jesus, who, as the Messiah, is going to take all of that punishment, the whole process, the painful, sacrificial process that is understood as required. Jesus is going to take that on himself. He's going to accomplish all of that so that we get the Joshua treatment, where when we come before God, he just cleans us up through his own effort and not ours.
I gotta take.
Going to take exception to that? All right.
Even Jesus required many people to take some sort of physical action in order to be healed or to justify his involvement. There was something physical had to happen, whether it's blood on the eyes, or go down and wash, or in the case of the man healed on the mat, the effort was, I think, prior to, because there was all the effort to get him to lower him to where Jesus was, or the effort. It just seems to me there's always a case where you can make an argument that there's some sort of, it's not just handed. In this case, yeah, I can see that, but in almost every instance, I see some sort of physical effort, either before or afterwards, on the part of that person involved with that healing, being made righteous, whatever. There's an action. Maybe that's a better word. An action that has to be accomplished or achieved. Am I wrong in that? Seems to me that there's a very close correlation. He expects you to do something.
Well, in some, it was just your faith that healed you. There wasn't necessarily an action.
I'm not saying it's universal. I'm just saying it just seems to me there's a pattern of in many cases there being something that needs to be done. It's not just poof, you're healed. There's a process.
Well, maybe here it's his faith that he did.
Yeah, I don't know. I can argue.
Well, we could.
Sides of that coin, I guess. And it's a small thing. I shouldn't have mentioned it at all, really.
Well, if you think about it, in verse 3 it says, the vision was, Joshua was standing before the angel of the Lord. So, yeah.
Joshua is in the presence of the Lord. He wishes to be there. He wants to be with the Lord. He has shown some faith in just that being in that position. And this is a visionary experience, but Joshua is functioning as the high priest, so he is in that role, and he's not shirking that responsibility. He's assuming it, and he is there before the Lord. Now, let's say, Haggai, in his own book, addresses a question of how is it that something can become holy when an unholy thing cannot make something holy. If an unholy thing touches a holy thing, it makes the holy thing unholy. The holy thing doesn't make the unholy person holy. It is the other way around in the experience of the law. The law is a process of making things holy before the Lord, and any exposure to unholiness makes holy things unholy. And so, if you follow that law, that that thought to its logical conclusion, it is impossible for any human to make something holy, because humans are unclean just by virtue of their living. In that world, death was unclean. Anything that had died is unclean, and you can't be human and live in our world without being around death at some point in your life, or around unclean things. So uncleanness is just the natural order of humanity, and we cannot make things clean. And here I think Zechariah is doing a similar theme. Joshua cannot make himself clean. Even the acts of sacrifice, and this is part of Haggai's point, even acts of sacrifice don't clean you, because you have to touch the sacrifice before you make it, and by doing so you have sullied it. You cannot make yourself clean. Even your sacrifices can't do that, is part of Haggai's point. And part of Zechariah's point is that, therefore, God is not going to rely on that sacrifice for cleanness. He is going to provide it himself. He is going to bring that clean. Now let's go on. The angel of Yahweh then made this declaration to Joshua. Yahweh Sabaoth says this, if you walk in my ways and keep my ordinances, so there's an expectation of obedience there. You shall govern my house, you shall watch over my courts, and I will give you free access among those in attendance here. For this is the stone which I have put before Joshua, a stone on which are 7 eyes, and I myself shall cut the inscription on it. Yahweh Sabaoth declares. And you'll notice that the verses skip around. If you're following in your own Bibles, you'll see this is verses 6 and 7, and then it skips down to the first part of 9. This section of Zechariah seems to be a little bit disjointed in its narrative flow, and so I'm using the presentation from the New Jerusalem Bible, which actually, it wasn't me who made this skipping around, it was the New Jerusalem Bible translators who tried to orient the text so that it flowed a little more logically. So this section, Zechariah is a challenging book in more than one way, but this is one of them. But he put this stone with 7 eyes as part of the explanation, and he has set this stone in front of Joshua. It seems like this might be a reference to the temple. The stone is like a symbolic object that represents the temple itself. And these 7 eyes are going to come up again in this section. I tried to really dig into a stone with 7 eyes and find some correlation to something. And of course, the New Testament in the book of Revelation also speaks of 7 eyes. But I was trying to find context in the Old Testament or a contemporary with Zechariah to try to put something together for 7 eyes. I couldn't find anything. There was one possible hint that maybe the temple had 7 gates, 7 ways into the temple. And so geographically, the stone with 7 eyes, the 7 eyes could theoretically correspond to like the gates of the temple for the stone, if the stone is the temple. This is one reason why it's kind of a difficult passage, is because what does it mean? But here, this stone clearly represents the presence of God. As we will see, the 7 eyes are God's own eyes, God's own vision that spanned the whole world. And here's the stone with 7 eyes. And so this place, or the stone that represents God's presence, is there before Joshua. And if he is going to keep his ways and keep God's ordinances, then he will continue to govern the house. And the house would be the temple, my house. It's a common reference for the temple in Jerusalem. And so this ongoing relationship is predicated on ongoing faithfulness to the Lord. And that is one of the themes of Zechariah, is that our behavior influences now and down the road and the future. And so faithfulness is the guarantee for Joshua to continue to function in his priestly role. And going down then to verse 8. So listen, High Priest Joshua, you and the colleagues over whom you preside, for they are an omen of things to come. For now I shall bring in my servant the branch, and I shall remove this country's guilt in a single day. On that day, Yahweh Sabaoth declares, invite each other to come under your vine and your fig tree. That vine and fig tree image is one of peace and tranquility and of fruitfulness and provision, and that when you're able to just invite your friend over to have a meal under the fig tree, that's a symbol that you're at peace and have plenty. And so that's the idea, is that will be a day of peace. And that is going to be brought on by his servant the branch. That picture doesn't continue on in Zechariah extensively, this reference to the branch, but Isaiah uses branch terminology clearly to refer to the Messiah. He also uses servant imagery to talk about the Messiah. So when he says, I bring my servant the branch, this seems to be an intentional anticipation of the coming Messiah will come and remove the country's guilt in a single day. I think that as Christians we can identify that day. That would have been the day of Jesus' crucifixion, on the day that he rolled back sin by taking it on himself, and therefore removing the guilt and sin. And not just of that country, although that country, Israel's sin, Judah's sin, was certainly incorporated, but he's going to remove all sin and take it on himself in his sacrifice. And that servant is going to come and fulfill things. It's interesting, he says Joshua and his colleagues are like an omen of things to come. I wonder if there isn't a little bit of anticipation in that Jesus, who is our great high priest, also has colleagues over whom he presides. That is his family, the Christians who follow him. That maybe Zechariah is saying, you and the people under you are a picture of Jesus and his apostles, perhaps, or a picture of Jesus and his disciples more generally, but a picture of what's going to come. And that fulfillment will come in Jesus, who is the servant, the branch. Now, a new vision occurs in chapter 4. The angel who was talking to me came back and roused me as though rousing someone who was asleep. And he asked me, "What do you see?" I replied, "As I look, there's a lampstand entirely of gold, with a bowl at the top of it. It holds 7 lamps, with 7 openings for the lamps on it." So he says he's like waking up, except as soon as he wakes up, he sees something that is clearly still dreamlike. So he's like waking up in his dream, but he's still dreaming or having a vision, because he sees a lampstand entirely of gold. And although he doesn't describe it as big per se, I see it, when you read the whole context, it's like that's all that he sees is a giant lampstand. I think of it as giant. Maybe it's just me reading into it. But this lampstand with all of these lamps, it would have to be somewhat large just to hold seven lamps on the top of it on this bowl. Now, I went to try to find some concrete representation of what Zechariah might be describing. And the best I could find was first an actual artifact that was dug up in Judea, Tel Dothan. And it's apparently a lamp from the late Bronze Iron Age. And this is a lamp. What's notable about this lamp is that it is a 7-wick lamp. You would actually, each one of those little indentations around the edges would hold a wick. And then the olive oil would be in the middle, so the wick would light. So this is actually a 7-wicked lamp that's from ancient Israel. And so this might be what one of the 7 lamps looks like. This might be something that looks like what Zechariah was imagining, or not imagining, seeing in his vision. A giant lamp in the Persian style with a single stand or like trunk. It does. The illustration shows it somewhat tree-like, And that's not arbitrary. Even the lamps that were described when they built the tabernacle back in Exodus, the lamps that were described there are described as having branches, and they were adorned with vegetation like acorns or other kinds of tree images. So even those were like tree images. This one looks more like a palm tree or a tree that you might find in Persia. It seems to have that Persian influence. And so atop of this central trunk is a large bowl around which are the 7 individual lamps. And of course, each of those 7 individual lamps has 7 wicks on it. So there's actually a total of 49 light sources on the top of this lampstand. 7 lamps with 7 wicks each. And the number 49 is an important number. It's 7 times 7, obviously. And it also is the number of years that are in between the Jubilee years, which was the 50th year. And so the number 49 is often associated with the whole Jubilee cycle of the Hebrew years, which is another messianic anticipation, because when the Messiah comes, he is expected to announce that year of Jubilee. So this indirect reference to that through 49 lights is, redolent. But the lampstand isn't the only thing that he sees. That's the main thing he sees, the first thing he describes. But then in verse 3 he says, "By it are 2 olive trees, one to the right and the other to the left. I then said to the angel who was talking to me, 'What are these things, my Lord?' The angel who was talking to me replied, 'Do you not know what they are?' I said, 'No, my Lord.' He then gave me the answer. He says, 'These 7 are the eyes of Yahweh.'" Again, 7 eyes of Yahweh, "which range over the whole world." Then I went on to ask him, "What's the meaning of these 2 olive trees to the right and left of the lampstand?" And I went on to ask him further, "What's the meaning of the 2 olive branches discharging oil through the 2 golden openings?" And he replied, "Don't you know what those are? Isn't it obvious?" I said, "No, my Lord." He said, "These are the 2 anointed ones in attendance on the Lord of the whole world." Well, thank you for clearing that up. So now we know precisely what those 2 olive trees represent, right? No. Again, I wish Zechariah had just recorded the angel, or the angel had just said, the 2 olive trees represent person A and person B, and then giving them names. Maybe Zerubbabel and Joshua. That is what a lot of people think that he's referring to. Joshua the high priest, Zerubbabel the secular governor, and that these 2, Zerubbabel and Joshua, are the 2 trees who are represented there, or at least the 2 branches of the trees that are mentioned here. But he doesn't. He just says these are the anointed ones in attendance on the Lord of the whole world. And the anointed one isn't even the regular word, which we know is like Messiah. That's not even that word. It's just the word, it's actually sons of oil, because the oil is, applied to them, and so they are anointed. But the phrase sons of oil is unique, only place. So I can't even go to another place in Scripture and say, where else does the word sons of oil appear, and see who does that apply to in that context. Can't do it, because it doesn't appear anywhere else except right here. So it's been very frustrating to try to provide the context for what Zechariah is describing, because it's just all very ambiguous, what it quite might mean. So I'm just presenting it to you as what Zechariah said, because I don't really have a great explanation for it. Now, when we get to the book of Revelation and we work through that, we will find that these 2 olive trees are actually mentioned in Revelation chapter 11. And so there's some context for how John in the book of Revelation is referring back to these 2 trees. But exactly what it means in its own context is just ambiguous. It could be Joshua and Zerubbabel. It could be Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets who are presenting God's word. It could be the law of Moses and the prophets. That's a common to some that are referred to as being in the presence of the Lord. They're just two sons of oil who are there on either side of the lampstand. And I'll just mention briefly before we get on to the real important part. The way this is pictured, if it is ever illustrated, and the way it's described in the commentaries, is that the oil from the olive trees is what is providing the oil for the lamp to be burning. And then that goes to reason, because it is a oil burning lamp. And so we have two olive trees, and olive oil was commonly used for burning lamps. So it just goes to reason that the olive trees are providing the oil to the lamp for it to burn. Except I don't think so. The way it's described in Hebrew, and it seems to me like perhaps the oil is coming from the lampstand onto the trees. After all, the trees are the anointed ones. They're the ones who are receiving the oil. The sons of oil are the trees. The trees are the ones receiving the oil because they're being anointed, if you want. Which is completely the reverse of any expected thing, because the lampstand would be consuming oil, not providing it. But the lampstand is God's presence, and the 7 lamps on top of it are the eyes of God. And so I think that the inversion is intentional to say that God is the one providing for the trees. The trees are receiving from God what they need, not providing God with anything, because God doesn't need provision, but He is the source of provision. So the Hebrew is unfortunately ambiguous, so there's just no way to pin it down. It uses at least a couple of words that are, again, found nowhere else, sons of oil being one of those phrases that doesn't appear anywhere else. And these golden openings, the golden openings are also ambiguously phrased here because that word's not used anywhere else either. So it's just odd. But let's get down to a point that I think is something we can relate to. We'll wrap up with actually it's skipping a little bit back up in the context of Zechariah in the usual sequence. Verse 6, second half of verse 6. This is the word of Yahweh with regard to Zerubbabel. Not by might and not by power, but by my spirit, says Yahweh Sabaoth. This is the needle point verse for the book of Zechariah. The verse that comes out in which a lot of people know, not by might, not by power, but by my spirit. I think a whole song has been written, a praise and worship song with that chorus in it. It's true that is what the message bottom line is. And the context of this seems to be the rebuilding of the temple. They started rebuilding the temple. They got its foundation laid. They got it far enough along to be able to do some work with the temple, but then they kind of gave up mid-process. And so they've kind of gotten apparently intimidated by the process of trying to finish it. It's just an overwhelming job to do. And this message is that your effort isn't going to get it done. My Spirit will. I will empower you with the Spirit to get this finished, this job finished. And that power will come from God's Spirit. Not that it won't take effort, not that it will be effortless to rebuild the temple, but your power isn't the only factor, isn't even the most important factor. The most important factor is God's Spirit continuing to enable you to get the job done. In verse 7, what are you, great mountain? Besides Zerubbabel, you shall become a plain. He will bring out the keystone while it is cheered with hurrah, hurrah. So the keystone, bringing out the keystone is one of the last pieces that goes into rebuilding a project like the temple. architecturally. The keystone is one of the last pieces that kind of holds it all together. Once you put the keystone in place, you've got the last piece of the puzzle, and then it can kind of hold itself up and be strong. Without the keystone, the pieces are still kind of wobbly. The keystone is what holds it all together. It's the opposite, if you will, of the cornerstone, because the cornerstone is the first stone you lay in order to provide the dimensions and to get the square corners exactly right. You put the cornerstone, and that's the first stone that you get. Everything else comes off of that. And then the last stone you put in place is the keystone that holds it all together. So he says, what are you, great mountain? Well, what is this mountain he's talking to? I think the most logical explanation is that the great mountain is the mountain of stones from the temple when it was toppled by the Babylonians. It represents the work and the effort that has to be done in order to rebuild the temple, because right now it's a pile of rubble, a mountain of rubble. And they have to take the mountain of rubble and rebuild the temple with it. And it looks like a tremendous amount of effort. The promise is, if they will rely on the Spirit of God to get them through, that mountain of rubble will become a plain. It will just be nothing, because the temple will be finished, and they will bring out the keystone from the rubble, and they will put it in place. And so the word of Yahweh was addressed to me as follows: the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple. His hands will finish it. Then you will know that Yahweh Sabaoth has sent me to you. This is why the temple rebuilding seems to be the context for this, is that Zerubbabel started it. He was there when they relaid the foundation, and Zechariah says he will be there when they put the keystone in place, that finishing touch. And that will be the sign. And it will be also the sign that Zechariah is coming from the Lord with a message, because when they put that stone in place and Zerubbabel is still standing right there, that's going to be the affirmation that Zechariah was there on behalf of the Lord himself. And then finally, I think this is the key phrase that I want to leave us with, and a challenge for ourselves. A day of little things, no doubt, but who would dare despise it? How they will rejoice when they see the chosen stone in the hands of Zerubbabel. And I think that chosen stone, again, is the keystone, that finishing project, and how you will rejoice. But before you get to that day, there are going to be a lot of days of little things, where progress seems slow, where the effort is hard, and the achievements are small. It's a small thing to put together the little pieces that have to be done. But every small step forward is a step forward to that final day when it's done. But our tendency, I think, in our own lives is to despise those days of little things. When we don't seem to have done much, when our day is the end of the day, we look back at what we accomplished and it doesn't add up to much or anything at all. I mean, there are days at my own work that I feel like that. I spent the day going backwards because I got 10 emails asking me to do projects, and I haven't made any progress on any of them because I've been trying to put out this other fire, but I feel like I've got nothing done. And I can despise those days. But Zechariah's advice is don't despise the days of small things, because they are building up to something. And if you're putting your effort into something worthwhile, there will be a payoff in the end. There will be a day of rejoicing. The chosen stone, the keystone, will eventually be put in place. So don't despise those days along the way when not much seems to happen. That, I think, is the most practical, day-to-day advice that I need. And I need that almost every day, because every day seems to be a day of little things sometimes. There are days of big things too, but that's not most days. Most days are the little things, the day of little things. But we need to celebrate even those.